Hello, this is Ben Kruger with Old School Manufacturing. Hey, we wanted to make a short video here concerning the assembly and installation of your John Deere 3-point hitch kit from Old School Manufacturing. This is for the John Deere 8000R series tractors. This covers the older R series such as the 8245R and will also cover the new John Deere R series tractors like the 8R370 models. It covers a lot more models than those. Those are just for reference point. So the first thing I want to tell you is that we did go ahead and do some preliminary here to keep the video from being quite so long. The two things that we have done are to remove the suitcase weights from the tractor itself. The second thing that we have done is we have went ahead and installed the E-bracket onto the tractor itself. Now the way you do this is to remove the top two bolts on your tractor weight bracket and go ahead and install that E-bracket as it's shown in the diagram. Okay, I do want to reference to you that we have designed a new E-bracket other than what is pictured here. It has 3 holes on either side, or a total of 6 holes. On the older tractors, you will use the inner 2 on either side. On the newer tractors, the new 8R series, you will use the outer 2 on either side. So we do want to tell you, you're adding in about a 1/2 inch spacer there with that E-bracket. You may need to contact your John Deere dealer and see if you need to get longer bolts, as you will be installing a 1/2 inch plate in there. Those are not supplied with the kit. Once you have that in place, the next thing we want to do is to bolt the top hook, which is part F on your diagram, to the universal main 3-point rear plate, which is part C. We will do this using 2 of the bolts that were supplied, and we will only use the outer 2 bolts. Do not use the inner 2 bolts. We typically do this by placing the bolt from lower to upper and putting the nut on the top of the top hook. This allows it to be tightened easier later on. So once you have that put on there, we're going to put it on there loosely. We are not going to tighten it. The next thing we're going to do is pick up that part C along with part F and hang it on the tractor weight bracket. That part is going to hang on the tractor weight bracket just like a suitcase weight, with the part F actually hooking on the lip on the weight bracket itself. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to locate part D. Now part D is actually going to couple part E and part C together. So as you can see on the diagram, there are 2 holes on either side that goes towards the front, and there are 3 holes along the back that goes towards the tractor or towards the back. So the easiest way we have found to do this is to place that part D up next to part E that's on the tractor already and install those bolts. Now on these bolts, we typically run them from the top to the bottom, placing the nut on the bottom, and this allows for easier tightening of those bolts. Don't tighten them yet though, just put them in place. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install the front bolts on that bracket. So these bolts would go from part C to the rear, and the nut would be against part D. On part C, you'll notice 4 holes stacked on top of one another. We're going to be using those center 2 holes. So go ahead and put those bolts in. Don't tighten them yet. Once you have all 4 bolts in place, lift up on part D so that it's closer to the weight bracket, or as close to the weight bracket as you can get it. Make sure you don't lift up far enough that you disengage the top hook from the lip on the weight bracket itself. Just lift it up against there gently and tighten the 4 bolts that go from part C to part D. Now one thing I do want to tell you, the bolts on part D are very close together. So you have a hex-sided bolt there. You can get a socket on them, but you do not want the nuts to be point to point you want the flat side of the top nut to be parallel with the flat side of the bottom nut. That way you can get your socket in between them. So go ahead and get it lifted up to the top of that slot so it's closer to the weight bracket, and tighten those nuts down. Okay, so after you have that in place, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install part G, the weight bracket wrap. We're going to do this by using the top two center bolts of part F. So this weight bracket wrap is going to do just exactly what it says. It's going to come across the top of your weight bracket, go down the inside of your weight bracket, like between the weight bracket and the grill of the tractor, and then come down below the weight bracket. So we'll go ahead and put it in place. We'll install those top two center bolts. We'll put the nut on top again. And then after we have that in place, the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and install the lower bolt. So the lower bolt will actually go between part G and part C. We typically place this or install this from back to front. So the nut would be against part C and the bolt head would be against part G. So once you have that in place, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to tighten the 4 bolts on part F. So typically I start with the outside 2 bolts, do both of them first, then I do the inside bolts. Next, I go ahead and do the bottom bolt, and then lastly, I tighten up the 3 bolts between part E and part D. So part E is that part that goes up against your tractor weight bracket itself, and then part D is the part that connects C and E together. Go ahead and tighten those 3 bolts. So now we have all of our bracketry in place. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the part B universal lower 3-point arms to part C. So the way I typically do that is I allow the lower part of those arms, in the diagram that's the part that's closest to part A, I allow those to set on the ground, and I place the upper part of those arms, which would be the part of the arm closest to part C on the diagram. I place those in line with the lower holes on your part C, and I typically run the bolts from the inside to the outside. So my nut is going to be on the outside of part C. So go ahead and put those 2 bolts in place. Once you have them in place, you can go ahead and tighten them down. So the next thing I typically do is you'll notice that there are 2 pipe plugs just above that bolt on the part B universal lower 3-point arms. If you have not already installed the grease zerks that were supplied, remove the pipe plugs and install those grease zerks now. Okay, so the next part of the process is installing the 2-inch by 8-inch 3-point cylinders that were supplied with the kit. So this is done by installing the tube end of that cylinder against part C and the rod end or the ram end against part B. The bolts were supplied for this. I will tell you that there were no bushings supplied where the tube of the cylinder meets part C, that universal backing plate. They are not needed, but some people like to put them in there. If you wish to cut bushings and put them in there, feel free to do so. Once again, they're not required, but it makes some people feel better to have them in there. This would be on the top end of the cylinder or on the tube end of the cylinder where it hooks to part C. So after you have that cylinder in place, go ahead and raise up your part B to meet the cylinder and install the lower bolt in those cylinders. Once you have all those bolts in place, go ahead and tighten everything up. So the last part on the 3-point assembly would be to install part A, the locking pawl. So whenever you hold up this locking pawl, it's going to look like one of two things. One of them is going to look like a set of goggles. This would be for a 30-foot model or smaller. The second option will look more like a triangle. It'll have 3 holes in it where the first option would only have 2 holes in it. If you have the 2-hole option, if you hold that up and look at it, it kind of resembles a set of swimming goggles like you would see at the swimming pool. You'll notice on that goggle looking piece that one side is slanted toward where it would go over top of your nose, where it's actually going to go over top of the lower 2-point pins on your applicator boom. We want that slanted or slotted side to go towards the tractor, not towards the applicator boom. So once again, if you hold that up and you imagine that being a set of goggles, make sure that that slanted side is towards the tractor. So there were 2 half-inch bolts that were supplied with this with nylock nuts. Those 2 half-inch bolts need to go from inside to outside. Once again, those 2 half-inch bolts need to go from inside to outside. If they're installed the other way, when you hook up to your boom, it will hit the framing of the boom and mess up the threads on your bolt. So install them from the inside to the outside. So the next thing I'm going to tell you is on your cylinders themselves. They do not come pre-plumbed. We do supply a hydraulic diagram with instructions telling you what length of hose goes where. The hydraulic cylinders themselves, the 2x8 hydraulic cylinders themselves, have 2 plugs in them. They're an O-ring type plug. They require a 3/8 inch Allen wrench to remove them. So one little trick on that is you can remove the top ones and you have nothing to be concerned about. When you remove the bottom ones, loosen them up about halfway and then apply pressure to the outside of your lower lift arms, and this will keep it from puking oil out at you. If you remove them all the way, when the cylinder reaches the end of its stroke, it will squirt oil out of the cylinder. This will be the outside port of the cylinder. So if you remove the plugs entirely, make sure to put a rag over the outside ports on the cylinder, or the ports closest to the rod end of the cylinder. Otherwise, you may get a bath. So we are going to show you some pictures here of the 3-point kit plumbed. Once again, the instructions and the diagrams were supplied with the kit, and they will help you get through that process knowing what fitting goes where. I will tell you this, there are 2 different diameters of hoses supplied. One is a 3/8 inch, one is a 1/4 inch. And I'm referring to the longer hoses, not the shorter hoses. On the longer hoses, the 1/4 inch diameter hoses will go to the 3-point and to the top link cylinder. Your system came with a top link cylinder. If you have not located it yet, look inside the cart towards the rear of the large pulley, and it will be located below the drive shaft. Once again, this is the 2-inch by 10-inch top link cylinder. It'll be inside the cart below the large drive shaft at the very rear of the cart. So those hoses are pretty self-explanatory as far as placing them on the tractor. Obviously, they have to have enough length to hook up to the cylinder. The other end of the hose goes back and hooks into the remote of your tractor. The 3/8 hoses that were supplied, there will be 2 of them on a 30-foot unit, 4 of them on a 40-foot unit. On those 3/8 inch diameter hoses, there's not a real definitive way to know where to place them from front to back. So what we recommend doing is put your female Pioneer couplers on the front end of those hoses and make sure that those female Pioneer couplers are centered between the front and rear port of the top link cylinder. So if you hold your top link cylinder straight out, you have the front port that would be closest to the boom, you have the rear port that would be closest to the tractor. Make sure that those Pioneer couplers are somewhere between those 2 points. as they will hook up to the hydraulic hoses that are on the boom itself to fold the wings. We are going to show you some photos here of how we routed those on the tractor itself. Be careful of pinch points. We try to route them on a tractor so that the customer does not have to remove them. So you can see how we've routed it here. If you find a better way to do it, so be it. This is just how we've done it at our place. I hope the photos help. I hope the explanations help. We appreciate your business. Thank you and have a blessed day.